In January, three of us, April Knight, myself, and a young man by the name of Eli Beach Brown, who grew up here in Duluth, made a trip to the southern border. We went to a conference that's called Common Ground at the Border, and it's a conference that's done each year. It's hosted by a UCC church that's quite close to Tucson. I want to start with just a couple words about the border. This is the border in southern Arizona, and the Tucson sector goes from Lukeville down to Douglas. So that's the area of the southern border with which I am most familiar. This was my fourth trip, I think, to work with humanitarian groups that are down there. Between Lukeville and Douglas, and the ports in between, it's 262 miles that looks like this. It's very rough terrain. There's another picture of what it looks like. In spite of the fact that it's a really rough terrain, folks cross between those ports of entry that you saw. And the United States response to that has been to build this huge barrier with the road right along it that's used by Border Patrol. There are places where originally it was vehicle barriers like this, and then those got torn down and 18-foot bollard walls were put up, and then those were torn down, and now they're 30 feet. And the reason that they're 30 feet is because if people try to climb over them, at 30 feet above ground, you get dizzy and lose your sense of balance. And so that's the reason why the walls now looks like this. There are places where the terrain is so tough that they can't build that kind of a wall. And you can see this is a gap where they tried to actually blast off the top of the mountain and finally gave up. And down at the bottom of that mountain, there isn't any fence. There are also a few places along the wall where, because of the rains that come through the arroyos, they can't put the billards up. And so there are spots like this along the wall as well. It used to be that most of migrants that came were young men. They tended to travel in small groups. And this is a picture, this is not my picture, but a picture from some years ago, Border Patrol having met them. And they basically were coming to work. And when 2019, when I was in Guatemala, I was still hearing stories about people coming with coyotes. There were people they knew, maybe somebody from their village that had come to the United States and made it and then went back to get other people. But now, almost everybody who comes with coyotes that are part of the cartel. And there's a lot of extortion along the way. And this is also not my picture, but I wanted to be representative because so many of the migrants now are women and children. We visited a shelter on the other side of the border in Nogales, Sonora. And April will be telling you a little bit more about it. But this is a mural that was on the office wall outside the office. And you can see down in the corner there the images of a lot of people coming from all over the world. And that's another one of the changes. It used to be that most of the migrants that came from someplace in Mexico or Central America, or maybe even South America, places like Venezuela. But now people are coming from all over the world, and groups that have been met there. My friend Randy says, I used to be that as long as I had a Spanish speaker with me, we were in good shape. But he said, I don't even know what kind of a dictionary to take along because I meet people from African countries that speak French because that's the colonial language, as well as people from China and Russia, and literally it's a global group. And you can see that that's tried to be portrayed in this mural. So this was a group that I met last April. I was part of a group that went out into the desert along the wall. And again, you can see that this is mostly women and children. This was two family groups that were traveling together, had been escorted across the wall by coyotes. They were trying to get reunified with family in Nebraska and someplace else in the interior of the United States. When we met them, they were resting underneath this tree. It was April, but it was already really warm in the desert. There's a camp at the end of the wall that had been put together by humanitarians, and we escorted them to the camp with big tarps where people can rest in the shade. And until a couple of weeks ago, it was the practice of Border Patrol to show up about 7 in the morning and at 2 in the afternoon. And the purpose was to pick up the migrants who, for the most part, were asking for asylum. And so the process to do that starts once they get turned into Border Patrol. So they turn themselves in and start the processing. So we were with them, just kind of hanging out, listening to their stories, playing with some toys that the small children had, and trying to stay cool. This is Randy Meyer, who's the pastor at the Good Shepherd Church and has been doing this work with humanitarians for about 25 years. And he goes out to the wall. Probably the most heart-wrenching story that I've heard from him was about the night he and the Lutheran pastor Pedro camped out on that road close to the wall. And about midnight, they heard noise on the other side. It was a coyote with a 5-year-old who was traveling alone. And he had a phone, and on the phone was his father, who was in Tennessee. And the coyote actually asked Randy and Pedro if they would take care of the boy through the night and then get him to Border Patrol so that he could get shipped off to Tennessee the following day. The humanitarian groups put out water in the desert. This is from the camp. A lot of times they use these 55-gallon waters. And this was a sign that one of those places where there isn't any wall, right across from it, the humanitarians had posted this sign 25 kilometers that way, pointing to the closest Border Patrol station. This is the picture of the camp. It's been disassembled because since the new administration, there's now just a few like water containers and some boxes of food. But this is what the camp looked like for several years prior to that. Some of the humanitarian work at the border includes these groups, Salva Vision, which was put together by a woman who almost died in the desert in the 1980s when she came from Central America. The Samaritans, I'm wearing one of their t-shirts. When I go down, that's the group that I have worked with. Humane Borders, Kino Border Initiative, which is a bilateral group. It's both Mexicans and Americans working together. Border Community Alliance, No More Deaths, Doctors Without Borders, and Voices from the Border. And each one of those groups kind of do their own piece of the humanitarian work, but they all work together. And this is a picture of the church and Randy. Randy's been doing this ministry for about 25 years, and the congregation has been very much involved. It's kind of the home base for several of the humanitarian groups.
So I'm going to speak a little bit about the practicality of our conference. So it's Common Ground at the Border is the name of the conference that happens annually. So it happens pretty much every January, and it's a Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Charlotte and I extended ours through Sunday so that we could go to the church service at the UCC church where they held the conference that weekend. So every year they hold the conference, Common Ground at the Border, at the UCC church in a town called Suarita, which is south of Tucson. And so that's where the conference happens every year. At the time of registration, because you do register prior to the conference, you can sign up for field trips and for classes. at the time of registration. And so our field trip that we signed up for was to go across the border into Nogales, Mexico, to an asylum center, which I'll talk about later. Another example of a field trip was a water drop in the desert. That was another group. And then another group did a Nogales walking tour. And so that's day one, is field trip day on that Thursday. You gather that morning, it's pretty much all day traveling, crossing the border and experiencing that the first day. And then the Friday and Saturday, there are speakers in the morning. There's authors. There are, we had a lawyer speak to us, an immigration lawyer. We had authors, people coming from all over the United States speaking. And then in the afternoon, we had classes. So we took a class, Charlotte took a class on weaving. We had another class on painting crosses, and then a man takes those crosses out to the desert where people have died and he puts them out. There is classes on solutions at the border. So there's different classes you can take in the afternoon, and it really felt like, to me, like a college retreat almost. There are people coming from all over the United States. There's retired ministers that are coming. There are people coming from Maryland, from Oregon. There was a videographer that came from the DC area. And you sit down at this conference, and to your left and to your right are people that you have something in common, because you want to know more about what's going on at the border. And so it was very accessible that way. It was very well run. They've done this for, I think, 11 years. So this is the picture here, is the church at the inside of the sanctuary where we had our conference. This is the courtyard of the church where we had our conference. And this is a picture of after they made their crosses. And the reason I'm showing this picture is to show that even though this was a conference, there was so much outside time, because the layout of this church has a beautiful courtyard. And this is where this group is standing. And this courtyard was used this weekend for a craft fair. So people who were selling their crafts, nonprofits were selling their crafts, migrants who have made art were selling their craft here. There's also high school dancers who came to this spot that you see here. So there's lots of times for breaks and a lot of time for community in this space, in this outdoor space. And this is an example of one of the classes. Charlotte here is participating in the weaving class, and it's another picture of the courtyard here. And you can see also, this is where we had lunch every day. Tamales for $5, homemade from the local people there.
So one of the things that Humane Borders does is it tracks the deaths that happen in the desert when remains are found of a migrant on one of the migrant trails. Humane Borders gets that information and records it. The red dot map is a map that gets updated every year, and you can see how many red dots there are. The big brown area is the Tohono O'odham Reservation, and you can see that there are quite a few deaths there. Oops. Since the year 2000, they've recorded places where 4,329 men, women, and children have died while fleeing violence and poverty in their home countries. Many other individuals go missing and are never found. Because the environment, I'm sorry. Let me see where I am here. So on the Monday before the conference started, humanitarians that were out along the wall found a woman who was propped up against the wall and had been deceased. They got there before dawn, and they had met on their way a young teenager who was just panicking. And it turned out that it was his mother. And it wasn't clear from the story at the point where I heard it whether she had actually deceased on the Mexican side and then been propped up on the wall, or whether they had gotten on the wall, gotten through the wall, and then she was deceased. A week ago, the group, the Samaritan group, went out and took a cross to the place where she had been found and had a little ceremony there. I was at the meeting of the Samaritans. They meet every 2 weeks, and I was at the meeting that happened after this particular incident. And there was a lot of processing going on as people related their experience of finding the woman. On that particular time, there was a nurse and there was an EMT person in the vehicle, the Samaritan vehicle, and they had really good cooperation from both the Border Patrol and the EMTs in Sasebe in terms of verifying that she was in fact deceased and then taking care of that. The man who made the cross is named Alvira Insquero, and he has taken on as kind of his retirement ministry, making crosses for those who have died in the desert and making a walk out and doing a little bit of ritual. He says he uses the cross not because it's a Christian symbol, but because it is a symbol in many spiritual paths. And one of the things I really appreciate about him, you can see his big smile, he's got a great sense of humor. But his conviction that even in death, people needed to be treated with dignity. And that's really kind of his calling. And it's really the motivation for all this humanitarian work that goes on, because without the humanitarians, there would be many, many, many more deaths because the environment there is so very hostile. So one of the afternoon classes that I took, we helped Alvaro make crosses, and we each were asked to make our own little cross. So that's mine. And we were asked what we would do with it when we brought it home. And my pledge to the class was that I would take mine to the vigil that we do here in Duluth around Christmas time. We do a vigil and name homeless people who have died during the year. And I said, I'm going to take my cross there because, again, that's a population that is often maligned. And part of the reason that we do that vigil is because even in death, we want to uphold individuals' dignity. While I was in Arizona, later on after the conference, I went to the museum that's on the University of Arizona campus. And last year, there was a big display of quilts that were welcome quilts. There was a big project of having people make quilts that were then given to migrants or were placed in public places, declaring welcome and safety for migrants. This year, that same area was devoted to another quilt display. For every year, there was a quilt made. All of the fabric in this quilt came from the remains of fabric found in the desert, things fabric that had been left behind. And every one of those little stripes around the side contains either the name or just the word disappeared, and the date on which the remains were found. So this is just for 1 year, but it really spoke to my heart. This is another quilt from another year. So there's a group in Tucson that collects the materials and makes a quilt representing migrants who have perished in the previous year. This is a group that I went with from Salavision. We were going to Nogales, Sonora, And our mission on that particular day was taking things, supplies for deportees. So we were on the Mexican side, and now this was the week after the inauguration. And people were being deported, coming through the processing center, the repatriation center in Mexico, and then being boarded onto buses and taken to probably the capital of Sonora, from which they would then find their way either back south or to their families or wherever they were headed. In the Border Patrol processing, everything gets taken from the migrants. Shoelaces get taken, caps, outer clothes. I mean, they literally come through the deportation center with just the clothes that they have, and usually they're allowed to keep their phones. Christmas Day, nobody knows why, but all the phones were also confiscated. Anyway, Salavision goes to the Mexican side after the deportees have gone through the processing and gives them hats, mittens, shoelaces, water bottles, things like that that they might need on their trip south. So this was our cart of supplies that we were on that day. This was a young man that we met who had come through the port of entry, had an appointment that he had to make to come legally. You have to make an appointment for your credible fear interview. You have to make that appointment online on the Mexican side. So he had an appointment. His appointment was for January 20th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. At 10 o'clock that morning, the app was taken down and all pending appointments were canceled. So he was in the deportation process, but he was trying to figure out, I mean, he hadn't come here, but he was in the area where they were doing the repatriation. He's from Colombia, and he was trying to figure out what to do, who to call, what his next steps will be. So that was a volunteer with Humane Borders that was working with him to try to sort out what his options were. In the area where we were, there were two posters on the wall. One of them, with all the red dots on it, is a poster discouraging people from trying to make the trip through the desert. And there's information about how much water they should carry and what kind of distances they would have to travel. The other piece is a piece where you can call if you have lost track of somebody and you think they might have tried to cross the desert. So it's also a place where you can call and donate your DNA if you think that you might have a relative that is out there someplace. They use a lot of DNA matching. While we were there that afternoon, there was an older gentleman came in with a younger man, and the two of them were just kind of walking around, and we engaged them in conversation. He was kind of looking over the line of deportees. He was searching for his son. And then the younger man went over to this poster and took a picture of it. And he said he wanted the telephone numbers on it. And the older man was like really upset. He was like, no, I'm not ready to call them. I don't want to call them yet. Certainly we can find them. The last he had heard from his son was 22 days earlier. And he knew that he had started out across the desert in Arizona. This gentleman is a Tohono O'odham Indian, Native American. Grew up on the reservation there. He's also a Presbyterian lay pastor. And for 12 years, his calling was to set out water on the reservation in a number of different places. He's now doing some other things, and I'll show that at the very end. But he was a Green Beret. He was in Central America during the 1980s, and he was part of the Special Forces there. And it was during that time that he says he had sort of a Damascus experience. He saw how the United States was undermining the civil society in El Salvador. That's where he was. And he came home just really upset by that. and vowed that he would continue to do humanitarian work as his way of standing up against what he had witnessed as a Green Beret.
So the first day of the conference, Charlotte and I went to Nogales on the Mexico side to an asylum center called La Misericordia, which is House of Mercy. And it is an asylum center for women and children and families because they are seeing many more women and children in this journey. And these families, these women with children, husband and wives with children, they apply to come to this center. And this is where they stay on the Mexico side while they're waiting asylum, while they're waiting for their paperwork. There's people there helping them with all of that. And this was the weekend before the inauguration that we were there visiting for the day. What you're seeing here is one of the dormitories where they stay. As we pulled up, the children were running around in the courtyard, running after the dogs because it was dog watching day. And so it was, that's what we walked into that morning, and it was fun to see, and the dogs were actually participating, so, or not, I guess they didn't have a choice, but. This is Sister Lika. She is responsible and in charge of this asylum center. This is where she lives. Her sister, her biological sister also works here. And she is also an artist. And these are her murals. This one is on the outside and this is on the inside. Her philosophy is that one of her big draws is to give the migrants themselves responsibility. And so we had a tour of the inside of a corn tortilla mill that they have there on the asylum grounds. And they produce, I don't know how many tortillas in a day. We were told, but we were taught that process. And the point is that we had to find the 14-year-old migrant who he was the only one with the key. So he was responsible for that space, for this mill, for this space. And she did not have a key, and her philosophy is let them be responsible, and they will take ownership of where they work and live. And so that was fun. And so he happily came over and gave us a tour of that space on the asylum grounds. It's a very industrious place there. Not only do they have the corn tortilla mill there, a lot of the women are involved in weaving and they sell their weavings. And there's two examples there on the table. And they sell them for a fair price. I mean, it was great to see that. Those are not cheap. And they shouldn't be. They're homemade. And this is one of the spaces in one of the women's looms here that you see. And there was many women doing that for money. Also on the grounds of the asylum center was a school. And I was struck by how much it looked just like one of our schools.
People stay at that shelter for 6 to 12 months.
Yes.
It's a shelter community.
Yes. Yes, they stay there between 6 and 12 months, working there, living there, going to school there. This is one of the weavings. This weaving is as tall as I am. This was in the school as well. And this is what I mean by it looking like one of our schools. I mean, Mr. Potato Head, that's universal, right? Mr. Potato Head is universal, but so some of the other scenes from the school. I was struck by how open Sister Lika is to having volunteers. I met a woman there at the center who was from the Twin Cities, she was a former teacher from Minnesota, and she was gonna be there for 3 weeks. And I said, oh, what are you gonna be doing? She's like, well, whatever they need. And Sister Lika, I interviewed her later, and she said, yep, whatever they wanna do. One thing they struggle with there, they can struggle with boredom as they're waiting on their paperwork. And I never would have thought of that. And so sometimes the volunteers are there just to help engage them in conversation as their children are going through school. On this day, this is the playground, and you can't see it, but there are children sitting in a circle on the blacktop, much as we would be during recess, and the teacher was in the middle of that circle. So this, you can see, is overlooking the town of Nogales, and this is the playground here at the school, at the asylum center. This tree, the purpose of this tree is the conversation tree, and that it's its purpose. It's considered a sacred space, and you can see two people having a conversation there at the base of the tree. And the person you really have a hard time seeing is a psychologist, a volunteer psychologist, who comes and speaks with the migrant women there. And so they were in deep conversation as we were passing. During this visit, Randy, the pastor, was eager for us to speak with Viviana, who was a 29-year-old female from North Carolina. And I'm from South Carolina and North Carolina area. And she had spent 17 years outside of Asheville. And I was so familiar with all the names of the towns. She came to the States when she was 2 years old and spent 17 years in North Carolina, went to school there, and unfortunately married a man from Mexico, who then convinced her to cross back. And so she was now stuck on the Mexico side with her 3 children. Her now ex-husband became involved with gangs down there, and so she left and she came to the asylum, and she was there with her 3 children. Her mom was still in North Carolina, and so she spoke with us for a long time, and I could have gone to school with her in North Carolina. And her story, she was hopeful. Her 3 children were just adorable, running in and out of the space that she was talking to us. But she told her story so well, and it really brought it home for me that, you know, we could have just grown up next door to each other. So she was awaiting asylum there with her 3 children at the school. And then before we left, they fed us lunch in this gigantic commercial kitchen with this beautiful, another mural in the cafeteria. And they fed us the soup. Pozzoli, right? So they fed us pozzoli. It was so good. I'm gonna shove it.
So there's a lot of rhetoric about what has changed at the border and what hasn't changed at the border. There have been huge changes because of the administration. Nobody now can come to the United States looking for asylum. That process has been closed down, for example. We can read in the newspapers and hear on TV about the increasing militarization at the border. But what I want to leave you with is about some of the things that haven't changed. What hasn't changed? One thing that hasn't changed is the commitment of humanitarians at the border. This is a picture of Mike Wilson when he was putting water out in the desert and using the 55-gallon can barrels. When those were vandalized too often, he went to setting up these jugs of water, and he would put them mostly in the formation of a cross so that they could be seen from a distance and people would know that it was put there in good faith. But now he says the thing that he can do to be most helpful is he's carrying out his humanitarian work through telling the stories of what has happened. So what side are you on is his own memoir and the story of his conversion and what he has done since. It was published last July, and you can get it at Zenith Bookstore. And then the movie, The Long Walk of Carlos Guerrero, is an independent film that was done. I saw it when it screened in Arizona last April. Just this week, it became available for rent on Amazon Prime. It's a full-length movie, and it's the story of Jeff from New York who goes back to Mexico in order to visit his ill mother, and then has to cross in order to get back to New York. And Mike Wilson plays the part that Mike Wilson played in that scenario. So he's learning to use other kinds of media to help tell the stories of what happens at the border. These are humanitarians. I'm there in the sort of in that top picture with kind of a pinkish top on and a blue hat. They still go out to the desert. They're still doing that. Last week, I was tuned into their Zoom call, and there are still migrants crossing. Not as many, but last week they found several groups of 6 or 8 walking along the wall. And of course, had to give them the bad news that at this point, they don't want to be picked up by border patrol. So there are still migrants coming, and there are still migrants dying. Those 2 crosses are next to the wall in Nogales, where there have been some deaths. Militarization of the border is only increasing. One day when Randy and I were out there together, the helicopter that you see followed us. I mean, the whole day that we were along the wall. When we moved, the helicopter moved, just hovered over us all day long. There are cameras and all kinds of security equipment, much of which has come from Israel. And then the border checkpoint, you can see that about 40 miles north of Nogales. They continue to build. There's a tremendous amount of money going into continuing to build, replace, repair. Randy told me last week, I was back here in Duluth, but Randy had told me about a place where there was a hole in the bottom part of the wall, and 6 people had come across there, and Randy had met them. And then the next day, Randy said it was repaired. This woman was the chief public defender for many years. She's now retired, and she's the primary legal counsel for the Samaritan and other humanitarian groups. Her name is Margot Cowan, and she was a presenter at the conference. What I really appreciated about her was that she just made the plea. Every single person has to be involved in helping to tell the narrative and retell the narrative, because migrants are portrayed in our public press as being dirty, as being criminals. And she said, we just have to tell people that what's going on. You know, it's people who are fleeing violence, it's women, it's children, and we don't hear about that. And she just really impressed on us, like every one of us has to be involved in retelling the stories. And the thing that I loved about it was she said, the best place to talk to people in the grocery store line while you're waiting to check out your groceries. And she said she often will do things like, if there's a newspaper stand close by, she goes and gets the newspaper stand, reads the headline, and says to the person in front or in back of her, So what do you think about this? And then she starts a little bit of a conversation, or she said, she told us about one story where she engaged in conversation with another gray-haired woman who had sort of the kind of snacks that teenagers like in her grocery basket. And she started out with like, oh, looks like you're buying kids snacks too. I have grandchildren. And so they started a little conversation about that. And then Margot said, how would you feel if your kids, and they ended up with a conversation about trans care. So Margot says, those kind of conversations can happen. You can go deep really fast and you might never see the person again in your life. But she was saying, don't forget to talk to people that are in line with you at the store. And the other thing that hasn't changed is a culture that is so full of joy. This dance group is a troupe that goes out and performs. And when kids graduate from the group, they go from high school to college, the younger kids in the troupe become the performers, and they raise money by their performances to help with the college expenses of the kids who have gone before them. This troupe came and performed a couple of times for us during the conference. The music, this was a gentleman from Peru who grew up in Paraguay, I'm sorry, and gave a concert that night. There's just so much joy in the culture down there, and that has not changed.
This was a mural, we are different, we are friends, and this was a mural at La Misericordia, the asylum center, and I think it just speaks to the hope that these families have, and this is what they see every day and what the volunteers see. I believe it was painted by Sister Lika. And I think it really speaks to how those conversations can play out, you know, the differences, but also the similarities that we have with our migrant friends. The butterfly is a symbol of migration. And this was either at the Tucson or the Minneapolis airport as I was traveling back. Beautiful.
So in closing, I just wanted to thank you all for the invitation to be here. But I also, Sherry's back there in a conversation now with somebody. Hey, Sherry, can I have your attention for a minute? I just wanted to recognize Sherry's support for refugees and asylum seekers here in Duluth and her support for this trip. So I brought you a little remembrance.